Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Virbac webinar on Tuesday evening. I trust you all had a great Easter holiday and spent some valued time with your friends and family. On site with me or online with me, I've got Adele Rothman from Virbac and Professor John Arthington. So he's just sorting out a couple of technical issues, but while we wait for him to join us online, let's get started.
Okay. Would you like for me to share my screen now, Adele?
Over to you, Adele.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us again for yet another webinar on some game-changing research with injectable trace minerals. But before I introduce our guest speaker, Professor John Arthington, and many of you don't need an introduction to Professor Arthington, just a quick overview of the work that we've been doing with Multimin over the years. So, over the last few years, we've had many published peer-reviewed scientific trials in journals across the globe, and we're very proud of it. And some of the major things we've uncovered, for example, and these are just some examples, are the lasting effects of injectable trace minerals on antioxidant enzyme activity, and advantages of injectable trace minerals in various production stages of animals. Calves and lambs, we've shown reduced severity and incidence of disease, less mortalities and morbidities. And as many of you know, Multimin helps boost vaccine response and recovery from disease. And in dairy, numerous trials, from reduction in mastitis, endometritis, stillbirths, to the latest trial, which shows a reduction in butterfat depression during early lactation. So also in terms of cow health and fertility, bull fertility, Multimin has shown increased first cycle conception rates, tighter calving patterns, and therefore better weaning weights and better bull and cow fertility. And a pilot study now recently done in Australia also showed that Multimin given with Virbac has seen some great benefits in terms of reduced fecal egg counts and weaning weights in lambs. But I just want to emphasize tonight that with all this research, Multimin is not intended to replace a good oral trace mineral program. It is the trials that have been done over the years have been with good oral trace mineral programs at 100% or even more of NRC levels. So please see Multimin as a tool for your customers and yourself to maximize performance, especially during critical phases when we know that, the trace mineral gaps are likely to occur. So with no further ado, I would like to welcome John Arthington to the stage. And you've seen a short introduction to John, but just to summarize, he's a graduate at the Animal Sciences Department of Purdue and Kansas State University, and has been a member of the University of Florida Animal Science faculty since 1998. Since 2019, he has served as professor and chair of the Department of Animal Sciences, and prior to this time, he served 14 years as a professor and director of the University of Florida with interest in trace mineral nutrition in beef cattle. And he's done also some wonderful work with Multimin, and will share some game-changing research and thoughts and ideas with you tonight. So over to you, John.
Thank you. I will share my screen now, and let's see how this will work. So I'm afraid that going into when I go into the screen presentation mode, I no longer have access to the presentation site. And so I'm going to try to put it in here. And is it coming up correctly, or does it still look like it's outside of presentation mode?
It's still outside of presentation mode, John. I think you can just maybe carry on like this. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Well, Adele, thank you. Sorry about that glitch, but thank you for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to visit with you all here this evening for you. I broke this presentation down into just a general overview of micronutrient nutrition of grazing animals. All of my data is from tropical and subtropical regions, so there is some applicability to South Africa. And also the experiences that we have had with Multimin over the years. I'll share with you a little history of that, and then give you some highlights of the responses that we've seen and the applications that we use this product for. And then I'll share just 2 or 3 slides of a project that we did some years ago in Middleburg, and the unique trace mineral characteristics of that local area. So to start off, whenever we talk about essential trace minerals for grazing ruminants, I tell people it almost always becomes a story about selenium. And so that's why I start with this, and then followed by copper, zinc, and manganese. Depending on where you are in the world, selenium may or may not be important to you, and we'll get into that more later. And then if there is a deficiency, and typically there is in one of these 4 elements, then we focus on ways to supplement animals. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, as I mentioned before, I'll conclude with some of our experiences with Multimin as an injectable trace mineral. Well, one of the good things about this area is we know what the animals need, don't we? We know that. It's just getting it into them that can sometimes be a challenge, particularly for grazing animals where we might be relying on a salt-based free choice product that they would consume at amount that at least something we would target to deliver the supplemental minerals. That doesn't always happen, right? Because there's variation in intake. The other problem we have is antagonists. And so we might be feeding or supplementing a proper amount of trace element, but there is an antagonist present that's binding that element and causing deficiency. And so we know what they need, but getting it into the animals is the problem. And so we're going to focus on these 4 elements that I mentioned before. And we'll start off with the most important, which is selenium. Now, selenium's interesting, probably the most interesting of the other divalent cations, in that all of the other elements plants also require. So the forages that the cattle are grazing, they require those elements too. But that's not the case with selenium. higher plants, order plants, have no known requirement for selenium. So we call that luxury uptake. So the selenium that's present in the plant is only there because it was present in the soil, and the plant takes it up in a luxury accumulation manner. So you can see an example here in the United States. If you look at the Central High Plains, the Dakotas, areas of Montana, Wyoming, they have high selenium soils, so their plants tend to be high in selenium, and there's never a selenium deficiency. You get into other areas out west or in the southeast, and there's low soil selenium, and selenium deficiency in both the plants and the animals consuming them are common. And I know that similar things have been done in South Africa, and you probably have some local knowledge about the selenium content of your forages. But toxicity and deficiency can be a concern, and that narrow range between the two is the closest, the most narrow of any of the trace elements that we're going to talk about. Generally, selenium deficiency is recognized by a disease called white muscle disease. And you can see here in this heart tissue, the white striations. That's just simply a reduction in antioxidant capacity. And so you have oxidative damage of the muscle tissue. This oxidative or antioxidative function of selenium is the connection between selenium and herd health or overall immune competence of the animal. And I like to use this data here by Jim Weiss from Ohio State University. All he did here was take dairy herds, and he just looked at the average selenium status of the dairy herd, and he regressed that over the average bulk tank somatic cell count. And you can see that it's quite linear, isn't it? As herd selenium status goes up, bulk tank somatic cell counts go down. It's a nice visualization of the impact. The area that I'm most interested in is in beef cattle, particularly grazing cattle. And we see here in this example where pre-weaning, calves here are weaned at 250 days of age, their selenium status decreases, right? So they're born quite selenium adequate. But over time, in that pre-weaning period, their selenium status drops. It does so at a very important time because we're getting ready to put these calves through the most stressful event of their life, and that's weaning, the permanent separation from their mother. And we're doing it often at a time when the animals are either marginally adequate or deficient in selenium. The reason they're deficient is they're grazing forages that are inadequate in selenium, they're consuming milk, which is low in selenium, and they're not consuming enough of the salt-based supplemental product to deliver adequate supplemental selenium. So this is a problem. I think this is a problem worldwide in areas where calves have inadequate or grazing forages with inadequate selenium. Now, next to selenium, copper is the most commonly found to be deficient. Copper is important for a lot of functions, but immune function is by far the most important. We used to think that copper was important for reproduction. We've learned later that the problem that we have with reproduction is not copper, but rather molybdenum toxicity. So the Kendall lab in the UK discovered this several years ago and has published several papers on it. And they now call it copper responsive infertility. I like that word because it's not, the infertility is not due to low copper, but you can supplement copper and bind the molybdenum and then relieve the infertility. So that's something that you might not have known before. Some important things to remember is to avoid copper oxide as a source of copper. It's not good for ruminants. Also, it's really important that copper and zinc be supplemented at the proper ratio. Now I'm putting on here at a 1-to-3 ratio. That's what I recommend. But certainly should not be less than 1-to-2 copper to zinc. We've had this problem in the US where people have fed high levels of copper thinking that they have a copper deficiency, and have ignored increasing the zinc. And they may or may not have had a copper deficiency to start with, but it's resulted in an overall zinc deficiency inadvertently. Now, I don't know if you've run into this in South Africa, but you can add copper sulfate to water sources, well water in a water tank, to control algae. It does control the algae, but it also interferes with copper nutrition of the cattle consuming that water. So I ask that people consider avoiding that. A lot of people think you can look at animals and determine whether they're copper deficient or not. And that's generally not true. Now, here's an example of a copper deficient animal that was provided injectable copper and returned to adequacy, and its hair coat returned to normal. A lot of people use this as an example, but under normal improved production situations, it's not very common. So I tell people, rather, if they have black animals or dark red animals, a severe copper deficiency, you'll see a white ring around the muzzle and sometimes around the perimeter of the ear. That white ring is very indicative of copper deficiency. There's an enzyme called tyrosinase that's important for the metabolism of melanin that gives hair coat its color. And that enzyme is a copper-dependent enzyme, and that's why sometimes you see that. Now let's move on to zinc. Zinc is deficient about 50% of the time. Depending where I am in the world, they may or may not have zinc deficiency, but it's almost always on the border. If we think that we want to get about 30 part per million dietary zinc into cattle, generally on a dry weight basis, forages run about 20 to 40 part per million. So you can see it's right there in that area. So what's zinc important for? I always tell people to think about rapidly dividing cells. Zinc is essential for DNA and RNA synthesis. And so anytime that you're dealing with a physiological function or tissue that relies on rapidly dividing cells, zinc can be an important player. So spermatogenesis in developing bulls, oogenesis in the female. When we think about skin or hoof care, problems with zinc deficiency can sometimes be witnessed with skin or hoof conditions. And then certainly in the immune system, where we have rapidly dividing cells following vaccination or other types of immune cells that require rapidly dividing cells. We did some early work in the 90s, mid-90s, early 90s, that resulted in an increase in the recommendation of zinc for growing bulls. It's not uncommon nowadays for people to feed developing bulls 60 part per million zinc in a total mixed ration. That's twice the NRC recommendation, but that's not uncommon today. And that result has shown greater or in more rapid sexual maturity of those bulls. This is particularly true when people are developing bulls to reach sexual maturity at 12 to 15 months of age. Now I'll just show one slide for manganese. Manganese is kind of the boring one of the rest. It's very uncommon that forages are deficient in manganese. Areas that you might find is where you have a high alkaline soils, or in diets that have a high grain input, because grains are typically low in manganese. Sometimes it's generational responses where calves, females born to manganese deficient cows, will have reproductive impacts that the cow might not have experienced herself. In my class, we talk a lot about the Liebig's law of the minimum. And any of you that are on this presentation, and if you've taken soil chemistry classes or soil fertilizer course, you've used this law. Basically, it tells you that you have to know what element is the most limiting before you create a rationale for supplementation. And generally, that's the case. if selenium is the most deficient and is deficient in the animal, supplementing more copper is not going to improve the production system. And so that is the basis for supplementation. And there's two different methods. One method is called the indirect method, and that's something you might not have thought about. You just simply planting a new forage because you think it will deliver better nutrition. That's an indirect method. Soil amendment, changing soil pH, and even biofortification. You might not have heard of biofortification, but certain parts of the world, for example, that are selenium deficient, add selenium in the fertilizer, and that results in increased plant selenium content. But what we're mostly familiar with is direct methods, such as the fortification of a supplement, or fortifying water, or individual animal dosing. So the individual animal dosing is the one that we're going to talk about with injectable trace minerals, but it's not the most common. Multimin is recommended for use along with, as a complement to, a well-fortified oral nutrition supplement. And the most common is a salt-based supplement. Now, you all probably know this, but cattle do not have a nutritional wisdom to consume any minerals. So if you've ever heard that saying, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that my cattle are eating more mineral, so they must be lacking in something, that's just not true. They are eating more mineral because something is causing them to crave the salt. And so we use the salt as a tool to both increase and decrease supplement intake. But for this to work, the nutritionist and the farmer has to have a lot of local knowledge to understand how seasonal and forage differences impact that salt craving. So this managing intake is the most important aspect of a successful free choice product or free choice system. I spend a lot of time helping people formulate a free choice salt-based system. In fact, I just did that this morning. It's probably where I spend most of my time with farmers. And what I should be doing is teaching them how to manage intake, because that's by far more important than marginal differences in inclusion of elements. So I just mentioned this before, but cattle just do not have a nutritional wisdom to consume minerals at the level that's needed, with the exception of salt. And so those two things that I told you about, they're just not true. The first one, if they're eating more mineral than they need, it's probably not going to hurt the animal. I always tell people you're just creating expensive urine, because they're just going to recycle that out into feces and urine. The next one, that could be harmful. And that's where we say they aren't eating the mineral, so they must not need it. And this can result in mineral deficiency because the animals just don't know what they need. Now, here's an example of variation over a year. And this is trying to target about 85 grams a day. And you can see that sometimes we're below and sometimes we're above, but overall, it generally hits the target on average, and that's okay. But it's based on this salt craving. And I can give you some evidence of that, and something you may have seen. If you take the exact same forage and you ensile portion of it, and you dry the other portion and put it up as hay, and you feed those exact same forages, which will have the identical nutrient content to cows, those cows that are on the silage, because of the higher moisture content, will crave more salt. So they'll eat more of that free choice mineral. So as forage dry matter increases, the craving for salt decreases, or rather inversely, as forages become wetter, more moisture, the craving for salt goes up. I hope I explained that there. The last slide I want to show you on supplementation is something that we published in 2021. It's quite interesting. Some of you probably have heard of the hydroxychloride minerals. It's a new form of inorganic trace minerals, and they differentiate themselves in that they are, I usually use the word poorly soluble, but I don't want that to reflect poorly on the product. The product's a nice product. They just are not readily soluble like sulfate and organic products. So here's an example of the loss of zinc and manganese in a free choice salt-based mineral that had either zinc or manganese delivered from hydroxy forms, sulfate forms, or an organic form. And you can see that after they become wet, after a rain event, you lose a lot of the mineral from the sulfate and organic form. So another thing I would like for you to think about is your salt-based mineral, if it's out in the pasture with the cows and it gets wet, what's actually left for the cows to consume might be much different than what you thought originally. So I'm just going to check to see if Adele has any questions for me, because I can't see you there, but it looks like everything's going okay. So we're at 12:30 now, and I'm going to move into a direct supplementation system related with injectable trace minerals. I had a unique experience with this product. I'd been working in mineral nutrition for a number of years, and I was traveling with a college friend of mine who is South African, and he and I went to graduate school together. And I was back in South Africa with him, and I had an opportunity to meet Willie Smith, a professor from Stellenbosch University. And he and his partner were the original developers of the multi-men concept. The product was already in the United States, but not many people used it. And it was really not a very popular supplementation option. I got to meet Willie, and Willie told me that there was a new person coming to the US that was going to take over the research, outreach, and promotion of the product. And his name is Lawrence Havinga. And Lawrence is a veterinarian from South Africa and moved to the US and took over the reins of the multi-men product. I got to know Lawrence shortly after he arrived, and he did something very unique. He pulled together the 4 or 5 scientists at different universities that were working with trace mineral nutrition and said, I would like for you to work with multi-men. And John, I want you to work in the stressed calf, in the pre-wean calf. And he worked around. And so Terry Engel from Colorado State, he worked with the feedlot cattle. Beth Kegley, she worked with high stress receiving cattle. Stephanie Hansen, she had just gotten started at Iowa State and was doing also work with feedlot cattle. Casey Olson was working in reproduction. And he said, I want you all to talk to each other. Well, we were already friends. We already knew each other. But the unique thing is that he sponsored research in all these laboratories and then encouraged us to share all of our experiences. And it really turned out to be a neat experience. It was both enjoyable, and we were able to more rapidly produce science, get that science published, and learn a lot about the product. I'm going to share with you the experiences that we had with the product. So we're interested in the stressed animal. And this figure here shows you the response of a copper-dependent enzyme called ceruloplasmin. Almost all of the copper found in blood is bound to this enzyme. And this enzyme's interesting in that when an animal or even humans goes through stress event, this enzyme increases. And so this student here, Joeva Hepburn, in my lab, she regressed copper status of cattle, and you can see that on the x-axis. As copper status goes up, the amount of ceruloplasmin change increases following a stress. So we know that copper is linked to this stress response. So we wanted to look at this with the application of multi-men. So here we're looking at 2 different enzymes, ceruloplasmin on your right and haptoglobin on your left. And if we look at those enzymes following injection with either a control saline injection, just saline injection, or injectable trace minerals, multi-men, you see a much more robust, what we call pro-inflammatory response. All right, so it's priming the immune system following injection. When we started to show this, Lawrence Havinga met with me and said, John, I want to look at using multimin concurrent to a viral vaccine in calves. I said, Lawrence, I'm not sure you want to do that, because if you're priming the immune system, you might be actually reducing antibody response, right? This might not be a good thing, what you're looking at here. He was convinced that he wanted to do it. And so we worked on this project together. And you can see here, the response we saw was an increase in titers against bovine herpes virus. That's the primary causative agent in infectious bovine rhinotracheitis when multimin was given concurrent to vaccine. Now, we've seen this now with other vaccines, and many other laboratories have reproduced this. But these are in calves, okay? And these are naive calves that have not been exposed to this pathogen previously, nor any vaccine. It gives you an example of this concept that I hear in South Africa called top-up, where people are using injectable trace minerals to calves that are otherwise mineral adequate to both increase or bolster trace mineral status, but also get this priming of the immune response that I showed you earlier through that pro-inflammatory reaction to get better or greater antibody titer. Now, let me show you this, how this can respond in terms of overall performance. This is some work from Beth Kegley that I mentioned earlier. She's from the University of Arkansas. And this was John Richeson's doctorate work, PhD work. He's also followed this up now as a faculty member at West Texas A&M University. But this is looking at injectable trace minerals, 2 different formulations or control, and that's in the light blue. And you can see that there's a reduction in morbidity and a reduction in overall antibiotic treatment if these very high-stress calves are treated with multimin or injectable trace minerals when they enter the feedlot. It's a neat response, kind of a neat application response. And overall, you can see that there's a reduction in overall cost for treatment when multimin is used in these high-stress calves. So why is this happening? You know, I keep talking about the priming of the immune system, but honestly, we don't know. Is it simply increasing trace mineral status of the animals? Now they have more trace minerals to contribute to proper immune function or immune competence? Or is it the priming of the immune system, that pro-inflammatory response, or is it both, or maybe something else? I don't really know. But I do know that in many different applications, the responses are favorable. So here's an example of the priming of the immune system to what we call an immunogen. This is porcine red blood cells. So an immunogen is something that causes an immune response, but not necessarily disease. So the animal's recognizing this as foreign, but not necessarily a pathogen. And we inject porcine red blood cells into cattle, either with or without injectable trace minerals, and you can see this natural increase in the overall humoral immune response to that reaction. Very interesting. So I showed you those calves earlier that were selenium deficient at the time of weaning. Not only can we increase immune responsiveness or prime the immune system, but we also now have a tool that we can come in pre-weaning. So these are calves that received injectable trace minerals prior to weaning. This is a time that I really recommend the use of a product like this. Coming in and using it in calves that are receiving vaccine prior to weaning for the first time. Now, we call this a pre-weaning or preconditioning application, where calves are getting vaccine prior to weaning. It's a great time to utilize injectable trace minerals or multimin concurrent to the vaccine. Not only do you get the priming of the immune system, but you increase trace mineral status of that calf, so you're weaning a calf that is more likely to be trace mineral adequate. It's a nice application. It's an application that I often recommend. So we're at about 12:40 now. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes showing you some neat, what I think are interesting um, responses or interesting data that we collected in South Africa. So I received a little bit of funding to look at the impact of what we call in the US acid rain or low pH precipitation on the subsequent trace mineral status of forages. And so I wanted to work in an area that was known to have this acid precipitation as a result of the sulfur being emitted into the atmosphere from coal-fired electricity plants. And so I worked with a couple of different individuals to accomplish this, and we did this work in Middelburg, in Mpumalanga province, but Middelburg, South Africa. I don't know if this comes in very well, but Professor Jans Myburg, Dr. Myburg, from the University of Pretoria, he was my collaborator on this project. And we worked with local veterinarians to find 10 different farms that were either distributed around or just in the prevailing winds of these coal-fired power plants, or farms that were to the north outside of the prevailing winds. And even the local farmers would recognize the impact of the acid precipitation in those areas. And then we collected forages and we collected liver tissue from forages grown in these areas and cattle that were leaving those areas. So I'll start with the cattle. Probably the most striking difference was copper. Now, these were otherwise quite productive beef cattle operations. But you look at the copper value here. This is on a dry matter basis, 58 milligrams per kilogram. This is highly deficient compared to highly adequate in the non-impacted areas. If we go down to selenium, you can see also a big difference. However, the cattle grazing the impacted area had adequate selenium, just somewhat marginal, but adequate. So I really believed that this was probably due to high intakes of sulfur. But if you look here, there were no differences in sulfur. In fact, the cattle, the sulfur contents were high, but they were high at both locations, about 0.3% on a dry weight basis. That's really quite high. That's a lot of sulfur. But if we look at copper content of the forages, there was no difference. They were low, but no difference between the two. So it presents a really interesting model and quite a conundrum for farmers and nutritionists that are trying to create solutions for cattle grazing these areas. It's probably also a reason why multi-min has been so thoroughly used in that region to help supplement those animals. So I would like to conclude now by just going over the three areas that I really think that the product like multi-min has some application in the beef cattle industry. One is that you can be assured a known amount of trace mineral being delivered to every animal. So it takes away that variability that comes from a free choice salt-based system that where the animal is deciding how much they're going to consume. Recent data, not just in our lab, shows that it primes the immune system. It creates greater humoral immune responses to a stress response and also to vaccine delivery. And then it ensures mineral adequacy during critical periods. And I explain that with the pre-weaning period for utilizing multi-min. And that time when I really like to use it is that pre-weaning vaccination in a normal preconditioning program. And so I want to end with a picture of the students in our University of Florida Brahman project. I don't know why. Someone asked me, why are they all girls? I don't have an answer to that, but that is what we have for the Brahmin Project this year. And if you want to learn more about the Brahmin Project, I encourage you to look at our website and learn more about what we're doing in both mineral nutrition and in beef cattle. And so I'm going to click back now, Adele, to the website, to the seminar site, and see if there's any questions I can address.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I just want to see if there are questions also from my side. I see you are you guys are welcome to ask any questions. John, yeah, while we wait for any questions, but I think you did a very good job of explaining. Can you hear me clearly?
Can you say that one more time, Adele?
Can you hear me clearly? I know we've had some technical issues.
Not very well, I'm sorry. But
Okay.
I can hear you when I listen real closely. And the other good thing is people can ask the questions in Afrikaans and you can translate them for me.
I will do that. Let me just see if there's... Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think John can hear me very clearly. But John, I'm going to type the question in the chat box for you.
Okay.
That I would like to discuss. Yeah.
Adele, there is one question in the questions tab.
Thank you.
John, I'm not sure if you can see the question.
I do see the question, yeah. I don't know if it would help or not. If the animal was deficient, mineral deficient, it would certainly help with the immune response to whatever the animal's being treated with, right? So by far, the elements that I showed you, particularly zinc, copper, and selenium, by far the physiological function that they impact the most is immune competence, right? So that's how I would answer that. Yeah.
There's another question for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I showed you liver data, and I should have explained that a little further. The very best indicator for deficiency is liver tissue, but it's only good for copper and selenium. Now, if I have the animals on an experiment and I know exactly what they're eating, then I can use liver for zinc also. But if it's a veterinarian that's sending me samples, it's only good for copper and selenium. But sometimes that's okay because they're the most important, they're the most commonly found to be deficient. And if they are grazing selenium deficient forages, and I find that the animals are selenium adequate, then I know that they're being supplemented properly. I know they're consuming the supplement properly. All right, so I call that a sentinel indicator. If they're selenium inadequate, then it could be a number of things. But a lot of times people are trying to test their supplement. And so if they're grazing selenium deficient forages and the liver tissue is selenium adequate, then I know that they are consuming the supplement properly. Now, blood can also be used for selenium indicator. And if so, I would recommend that you use whole blood, not plasma. You cannot use blood for copper at all. The only time copper could be an indicator in blood is if all of your samples are very low. That's the only time. Because remember, I showed you that one slide that copper will go up if the animal's stressed. So you can take a marginally inadequate animal in copper and stress it slightly, and the levels will go up quickly. It'll look adequate when they're not. I want to say one more thing. If you're using liver tissue, make sure the laboratory presents the results on a dry weight basis. You cannot use as is basis, or what sometimes people call wet weight basis. It has to be on a dry weight basis. Okay. No, liver is not a good indicator of zinc unless the animals are on an experiment and you know exactly what they're eating. Okay. It can really be confusing. The largest reservoir is muscle and bone. And in deficient animals, they'll reabsorb zinc from bone back into the bloodstream, and that will reaccumulate back into the liver. So you can have animals that are quite deficient in zinc and see liver tissue start to rise. It can be very confusing. Manganese, there's nothing for manganese. Manganese turns over so rapidly that if you are the manganese in the liver tissue that you test today represents what that cow ate in the last week or two. So it's a very mobile reservoir, and it's not a good indicator. Yeah. Yeah. So the question here is, should you recommend or could you recommend trace mineral supplementation in conjunction with vaccination? And definitely, animals, as I mentioned earlier, animals will respond better to vaccination if they're trace mineral adequate. Now, there's an added uh, benefit to multimin in this respect, because not only do you increase adequacy, but you have this priming of the immune system through the pro-inflammatory reaction. So absolutely, it's a good uh, idea. I think in the US, multimin's a little different because it has to be sold through a licensed veterinarian. So I think that is one application that has grown a lot in the US because a lot of our producers put their vaccine programs together in consultation with their veterinarian who has access to multimin. Yeah, and that's a good question. So, do different areas of the liver have different mineral concentrations? Yes, they do, but the differences are minor. I think we worry about that more than we need to. If you are skilled at the liver biopsy technique, I use a 16 gauge, the company brand's called TrueCut biopsy needle. Uh, and uh, we have some publications on this to show how to do it. We recommend an area on an adult animal that you would enter the biopsy needle. So you're almost always uh, biopsying the same area or lobe. Now, if you're collecting samples from a animals in a processing facility or maybe a post-mortem examination, pick an area on the face of the liver and use that area all the time, right? That way, all of your samples will be coming from the same face. I call it the face of the liver. You all know how huge the liver is as an organ in an adult cow. So if you were to collect, and we've done this many times, collect across the face of the organ, we do see differences. But there's more differences across animals than there are within animals. Actin 20s per weaning. Okay, so the question is at the timing of multimin. So in the model that I explained to you, where we're delivering multimin pre-weaning with vaccination, that's done concurrent. I think that is a good time to do it. Doesn't really make sense to do it 28 days before in that model because you'd have to bring the cows through the crush or through the processing facility twice. So now you have them up there one time with their calves, give them vaccine and give them multimin. Now the bull situation's different. I don't know how beef producers are in South Africa, but I expect they're very similar as they are in the US and my state of Florida. Bulls are too often an afterthought. I don't know if afterthought is a word that makes sense to you, but we don't think about our bulls until we're ready for them to go to work. And we use multimin in our bulls prior to them going out. So we bring our bulls up 30 to 60 days before the start of the breeding season. We put them through a breeding soundness exam. We give them multimin, we start supplementing them, and we just start watching them close. We start taking care of them. And that's the time, right? You want them to be able to have adequate mineral nutrition so that the sperm that they are ejaculating at the start of the breeding season, that was produced how many days before? I can't remember, but 30 plus days before. So having them in adequate, optimal mineral nutrition prior to the breeding season is really important. I wish I could get more of our producers to do this. Our breeding season here, we start generally January 1 to February 15. Now we're in the Northern Hemisphere, so that's very cool weather. And in Florida, it's the time of year when all the retired people come to Florida, right? It's a very nice weather. And so our cattle generally are doing very well at that time. And it's hard for me to convince producers to take better care of their bulls when the weather's so good that time of year. Yeah. So this is asking about preconditioning from 3 months old, wean at 7 months. Okay. So we have tried using multimin at 100 days of age. So that would be about your 3-month response. And we do get a response, but it's not as important as that later vaccination. The enzyme that I told you about, the ceruloplasmin enzyme, it's not even really functional until the animal is about 6 weeks to 2 months old. And so, it doesn't, it's hard to get, these enzymes are just getting started, like glutathione peroxidase. It's bound in, generally found within the red blood cell. That's a selenium-dependent enzyme. It's the most powerful antioxidant. And, you're just starting to initiate hematopoiesis, right? These red blood cells are just getting generated. So I'd like to see the animal at least 3 months before it's multimin's used. But then if you wanted to use it at 3 months and then again just before weaning, particularly if you were in a copper and selenium deficient area, that would work fine. But if I had to pick and I was going to use it once, I would always use it later and with vaccine. So this is a question about death after multimin. So we have not had any experiences with death loss. I can tell you that I've heard of some examples, and if that were to be the case, selenium is always the one that we would point at. I would like to see in the U.S. multimin be offered without selenium, so the areas in the Dakotas could more comfortably use the product. But selenium toxicity is a real thing, right? And it's sudden death. So you have two different types of selenium toxicity. You have the sudden death, which is cute, and then you have what we call in the US, we call blind staggers. So that's this more chronic selenium toxicity. But yeah, if that were to happen, it would be selenium most likely the culprit. I'll just tell you a quick 30-second story. We did a large reproduction study with multimin, about 4,000 cows enrolled. And one of my best cooperating farms, a really good beef producer, I knew his mineral formulation, and so we used multimin without testing the cows. And then later, I tested his mineral formulation, and it had 3 times the selenium that the label was supposed to have. It was formulated improperly. And I was scared to death because we had already injected those cows with multimin. I was just waiting for the phone call. And there was no problem. Nothing happened at all. So it would take a lot of, the animals have to be really high in selenium status for it to be a problem.
I'm not seeing any additional questions. I think we covered most questions.
Yes. John, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to say a couple of things on the toxicity question. We don't see a lot of adverse drug reactions in South Africa. The main cause, in my experience, is overdosing and injecting animals that are that the weight is unknown and in the case of sheep, when they weigh less than 25 kgs, it's also a risk to inject sheep at that weight. And then all PV data in the US and the EU do not confirm the risk of mortality. So I will definitely get into contact with the person who asked the question to see, what was the issues and what was the circumstances around it. I see another question from Neve Andrews: can multimin be used in wildlife? We do have a couple of vets that do inject, for example, sable with multimin. It is not, it's an off-label recommendation, so unfortunately we cannot recommend it like that, but a vet can certainly, if they want to, try it. But yeah, it's out of our hands. It's unfortunately not registered for wildlife. And just the question. Thanks, John, for the question of why at vaccination or 28 days before an event. We know that antioxidant enzymes start when you inject multimin. We see the formation of antioxidant enzymes approximately from 15 days to 30 days. And that's why we say 4 weeks before a critical event. And in the case of vaccination, we do see a response. It's just practically more, it's more practical to inject at vaccination as well. We do see a good response at vaccination. And then the spermatogenesis, the process of spermatogenesis takes approximately 56 days. So in South Africa, we normally inject 3 months before the breeding season for those antioxidant enzymes, to give those antioxidant enzymes a chance to form and to help with, spermatogenesis and bull fertility before the breeding season. And then some producers inject again at the breeding season, also for that time period. Okay.
So I don't see any further questions, nothing in the chat. I think we've answered all the questions. I just want to double check Carol Lee's typing something. I think we've covered all the questions for tonight, and we are right on time. Just a fantastic presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Professor John, and thank you, Adele, for hosting this webinar. I hope you all enjoyed it. It seems like you did with all the questions, and I'm happy to see that you paid attention. So from our side, thank you for joining us for tonight. I just want to double check. I see there's one more question. I'm going to just post this for you, John.
I do know that the question is about Jersey cattle that had adverse reactions to multimin. And I'm sorry, I don't have any experience with that. I have had experience with Jerseys being copper loaded by accident. And generally, where we see the problem is once they become stressed, right? Because when they become stressed, they dump that ceruloplasmin, that enzyme, into the bloodstream, and it causes all of the downstream problems. So yeah, I would be cautious if they're copper loaded to adding any copper to it. But I don't have any experience with multimin in that application. I appreciate everybody. Thank you for working with me on this sound thing. I think the questions typed in worked very well. So, and I can also hear you a little bit.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for Todd. I'm not even going to post that, but thanks, Todd.
Thank you.
As always. Thank you, everybody, and have a safe evening and a great week further. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Renee.
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.